fact, after joining the European Parliament, Ivan Štefanec cycled from Bratislava to Brussels. He did a short marathon on his bike, which was 1,200 kilometers, so I'm sure that his commitment to sustainable transport is here. And Ivan is also president of SME Europe. Please join us.
Thank you, Dimitar. Good morning, everybody. It's really great to be here and to start this special day. Yeah, you reminded me that I cycled, it was 5 years ago. I have to say it is not sustainable to do it every week, but I loved it. It took me 9 days and it was really great experience. And I'm a great supporter also for smart mobility, and I think we have to do much more for cycling, not only in Brussels, but also around the European Union. Just to kick off this panel, let me highlight the role of SMEs, and particularly role of SMEs in new green technologies. SMEs, they are really the major employers in Europe. We should highlight this fact that SMEs, they created in last 5 years 85% of jobs in EU. So we shouldn't forget that this is driver of our growth. It creates not only 2/3 of employment, but 85% of new jobs in last 5 years. So if we talk about new emerging technologies, we have to talk particularly about creating conditions for small and medium entrepreneurs. I think there are 3 major issues we have to tackle in this regard. First is financing, because very often SMEs, they still don't have enough conditions to get capital. And honestly saying, we have only banking economy in the European Union, particularly in comparison with US and also now in comparison with this Chinese economy. We have to improve situation with financing, and our priority for next 5 years should be really to build capital union in order to improve situation with financing. Second point is just skills. We have to do much more in order to get knowledge, and also in order to get much more skills. We are preparing on the level of European Parliament and on the level of European Commission a lot of programs like e-skills program. There is the program also Erasmus for young entrepreneurs, which can be used as the skills sharing among entrepreneurs in the European Union. This is very popular program, and from our position in the European Parliament, we would like to enforce it. We would like to see much more funding for sharing experience, and also to get more knowledge from entrepreneurship point of view. And last but not least, the priority is to complete single market. This is still not the reality in the European Union, particularly in the area of services. We talk about DSM, about digital single market, which should be also the priority to create a digital single market. But we shouldn't forget about the completion of single market in area of services. This should be also the priority for next 5 years. And if we talk about emerging technology, it's not possible without just completion of single market. So, and also one remark which I'd like to highlight today is that we need a special agenda for next couple of years, also in terms of green finance strategy. If we talk about our ambitious goals by 2050 to have a carbon neutral economy in the European Union, we should be example for the rest of the world. It is really ambitious, but we have to have the same methodology, we have to have the same strategy in the European Union, and we have to have, I think, a harmonized strategy. Because currently, what is reality, there is still a very different situation country by country, and I think also this is driven by the situation that we don't have harmonized the green finance strategy and the same opportunities for everybody in the European Union. We can talk about infrastructure, we can talk about taxation, there are many aspects, but once again, we shouldn't forget that there is the room for opportunity for SMEs, particularly tackling three major issues. And from my point of view, it is financing, so building capital union. It is skills, so preparing more programs for knowledge sharing among entrepreneurs, and last but not least, completion of single market. So I'm looking forward to this panel, because I think we have really excellent speakers from different angles to talk about this topic, and also I'm looking forward for cooperation next 5 years in the European Parliament in order to develop position of small and medium entrepreneurs, particularly in from the point of view of green technologies. Thank you.
I would like to invite the panelists to join us. So, there is a lot of talk about climate change in this city. I'm sure you're all aware. But when we focus on climate change in Brussels, we always like to address the micro perspective. There's a lot of talk about policies, about long-term goals, carbon emissions, the emission trading scheme. But I think it's extremely important to also focus on the implementation of these measures, and what do these measures mean for businesses? What do they mean for the private sector? What challenges are actually businesses facing when we talk about climate change and the green transition? We also like to say that the SMEs are the backbone of the economy, which is absolutely true. So that's why in this panel we'd like to involve them and involve the SME perspective and the micro perspective when we talk about the green transition. And I think we have a great panel of panelists to join us today. I would like to introduce, first of all, Eva Palachkova. She's joining us from the EPP party. She is working as a senior political advisor at the European People's Party since 2012. Eva's primary focus is on EU's environmental, climate change, and energy policies, as well as agriculture. In 2016, Eva was a senior diplomat working for the Slovak presidency of the European Union. And she also chaired the Council Working Party on Environment. Also joined by Andrej Sokufka, who is currently working as a senior public policy and government affairs manager with Google in Brussels, the European office. Andrej worked as economic advisor to the US ambassador in Slovakia, following his previous appointment as economic advisor to the Prime Minister of the Slovak Republic. He is also co-founder of the Slovak Alliance for Internet Economy and member of the Slovak chapter of the Fund for American Studies. Andrej, thank you for joining us. Last but not least, we have Peter Badek, who is currently the CEO. He's a serial entrepreneur. He's the CEO of two successful companies that he co-founded. Greenway Infrastructure, which is dealing with electrical vehicle charging infrastructure. And the second company is Voltia, hope I pronounced it correctly. The company is engaged in commercial electric vehicles as a service. Peter previously was a co-founder of a successful solar energy company, which he sold. And before entering the business of clean technology and renewable energy full-time, he worked as a banker for 8 years. Peter, thanks for being part of this panel. I would like to give all the panelists a couple of minutes for some kickoffs. This is a public event, so feel free to tweet, to take notes. We'll make sure we have enough time afterwards for a Q&A session. Eva, let's start with you. Can you share your perspective?
Yes, good morning to everybody, and thank you. It's a pleasure to be part of this esteemed panel. Maybe before we get into the practical topics of what the SMEs are facing when they try to innovate or greenovate, as we like to say sometimes in Brussels, I would maybe frame it a bit politically from the side of the EPP. For us, the topic of greening, it's an important issue, and it has been for many years already, but now it's becoming even more widely discussed, and other parties also see the priority on this. For the EPP, we are preparing our Congress in Zagreb, which will take place in November, 2021 of November. we will elect the new president, and we also want to frame the new EPP vision for sustainability, as we see that the voters and citizens are concerned with climate change. We can see it with the protest, with the movement, but also with the way they vote. The support of the Green Party has been, we have seen it rising in the European elections and in many local and national elections. And the center-right, we need to take this topic as our own, because indeed, actually, we do have the right and possibly only solutions to how to approach climate change as compared to either the Greens policies, which often are very nice to listen to, but practically are impossible to put in practice. And from the socialist parties, also for them it's difficult to tackle this issue if we suddenly want all the coal miner workers or factory workers to lose their jobs. Also there the socialist end of the spectrum doesn't have the right answers how to stimulate the economy. While on the EPP side, we think the right approach is not to overregulate or pick technology winners, but to provide them the right incentives, the access to finance, access to the right skills, so that they are incentivized to innovate, to enter the market, to stimulate research and development in the new technologies. And this, I think, is especially important for the SME sector, where such policies, most importantly, would also enable them to cut costs. So I think here I'm really looking forward to listening to the colleagues of how actually in the real world, in practice, what was their experience. From the EPP side, in terms of climate policy, we have been always driven by the social market economy. And here I will just mention a couple of important points that we will focus on in our next Congress. So we want to support the European Commission President-elect Ursula von der Leyen with her ambition to increase the European Union's target to reduce emissions to at least 50% by 2030. We commit to the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. And we want all sectors of economy to contribute to this and to then enable a level playing field. Here we look into possible new innovations in electrification, where I think we will hear much more about this also from the panelists, or hydrogen as a way to decarbonize the industry. But for this, we would need also clean electricity from renewables. So all of this can then work in symbiosis to provide reduction of emissions. And important focus is on circular economy. Here again, it's I think a big topic for the SMEs. Resource efficiency, basically how to do more with less. And again, we come to the aspect of reducing costs. And important factor is also digitalization and new technologies, which also enable such efficient management of resources and reducing the energy bill, for example, for the companies. Important, as I said, is the financial aspect, the access to finance. Here, this will have to come from private and public sector, and we are pleased that the InvestEU program will include important chapters on the SMEs. Maybe I can talk about this later on during the debate. And most or very important is also reducing the red tape, which I think the SMEs are faced with even when there are funds to access. Often they are discouraged by the paperwork or the very complicated structure in many then local administrations, and these funds are then not absorbed. So I'm happy to then go deeper into all of this. But yeah, thank you for this time.
Thanks, Eva. Peter, a couple of keywords from Eva's opening: access to finance, committed to the market economy, reducing red tape. Do you like these measures?
Well, yeah, this is a lot
Sounds great.
Sounds great, a lot of important things. But let me give you a few minutes for a very brief introduction about the topic I'm dealing with, which is electromobility and in particular charging infrastructure. I'm in the sector for almost a decade, and I really remember the times when it was an early stage, and what we see now in this respect is a completely different picture than I experienced 10 years ago. Electromobility, but for me, is what I want to say is only a part of very broad changes which we are experiencing now in terms of the green economy, and especially if we talk about the green economy in terms of the energy system. We see what I call the new energy system, which consists of the generation of electricity from renewables, delivered by smart grids, used by electric vehicles, and very big important topic of the prosumers. So basically, ability of almost or many customers to generate the electricity on site and by themselves, and not be dependent on the large sources of energy. I think we are, so as I said, this is a very broad topic, and we can then discuss how it interrelates between each other. And I think it's very important to understand that these parts, renewables, grid, electric vehicles, they interact between each other. So it's one ecosystem which needs to fit together. And especially if we talk about the policies, I think there is very often in electromobility, we need to have a correct policies. And for example, in the energy system, in the energy grid management system, it's a very regulated business. And now it's a versatile. Electric vehicles can deliver very valuable services to the energy grid. So what I would let's make a first statement is that all these technologies which we are evolving now cannot be taken into account in some kind of isolation. It has to be taken in a one package where everything works together and interact with each other. If I talk specifically about electromobility, because this is more my topic, and then specifically about the charging infrastructure, I think and it is recognized that we have unique opportunity to significantly change the way how we deal with the problem of the health environment in our cities. We have a significant change how to tackle the climate change. We have as well significant change with the reintroduction of electric vehicles, how to deal with the energy security, especially if we talk about the oil, that we are very dependent on oil imports, and even a slight change on this dependence. I'm not saying that we are going to stop import oil from tomorrow, but even the slight change and setting of the trends could be very important in a position of Europe, how it's able to deal and communicate and negotiate with partners who are delivering this kind of energy resources to us. I think it's extremely important that we make this clear commitments towards the reduction of using of traditional cars and setting these trends. This is, as I said, to support us in a way of providing security to Europe as such. And what is definitely very important is as well that all these things are happening in a combination of two things: it's the policies and changing in the development of the technology. It wouldn't work one without each other. So we would have very good policies. If it doesn't fit to the technology development, it wouldn't work on the other side. If the technology development wouldn't be supported by the policies, it will not work. So I think this is as well very crucial to understand that if any kind of a policy is made, it needs to be very clearly observed what's happening on the technological development side and needs to fit to it. And I see here a very big struggle, timing. How fast the policies measures are transformed. And very often, and I think it's not only the case of the electromobility, but I think maybe Andre will talk about the IT and other stuff. Sometimes the policies doesn't keep the speed of the changes in development of technology. And so if I would say in general what is needed in this respect is to improve the capacity and capability of our energy policy setters and the policymakers and the regulators especially in the energy sector, to keep up the speed with the changes of the industry. If I just point to this topic, regulation in energy system, and as I said, electromobility is very much linked to energy system. It is changing extremely quickly comparing to what we saw in the last 100 years. The energy and all the energy sector has an innovation cycle of 20 years. It has an innovation cycle of 20 years, but it doesn't have anymore. The things are changing much more faster with everything in the world, and the new things from IT and data and everything comes to this sector and shape them. And what we see is that, in my view, the regulation is very, very slowly progressing. In this respect, I would say the good job is made in Brussels very often, and not so good job is made on local level when the regulators are not leading the discussion. I think this is an important thing, that regulators and policymakers should actually be one of the, I'm not, probably the technology guys will lead the discussions always, but they should be very, very closely follow them. Because I think the structural problem is that regulation before was made in order to make sure that the energy sector is safe and cost-effective. So this is heavily regulated because it's a monopoly in certain situation. You know how the energy sector works. In a certain area, you have a monopoly of the distribution network, for example, and therefore you have a regulator who makes sure that it works. From a safe point of view, that everything is safe, and that basically they are not charging more than they should. That's fine. These two things it needs to be here, but and I think the regulators should as well understand that the speed of the changing of the sector and should get another role, which is changing of the environment in a way which will reflect the changes of the technology, which they never did before. So. I don't know, too many topics open. Hopefully we can go through it in the debate.
Thanks for the great intro on this topic. Andre, where does the technological sector stand in this? Give us your insights.
Well, let me start with a very brief question. Can I ask you, do you know what was the historical happened last weekend on Saturday? The marathon runner, exactly. So there was Elodie Kipchoge, who broke a historical, seemingly unbelievable record of running marathon below 2 hours. Now, why I'm mentioning this is because now what we will see in the sports is that there will be more people coming close, running even better, and some of them even running against this 2 hours, similarly to him. And I think I find this an inspirational example of what is happening in the technology world as well. So there is oftentimes either a large or a small company that breaks certain technological achievement, does a certain technological innovation. And then what we see, especially in the SMEs, as Mr. Stefanes was speaking, as at the SME level, many SMEs catching up much more quicker to achieve that technological or to have advantages of the technological breakthrough. And why I'm mentioning this as an introduction to the panel, which is speaking about, where I would like to speak about artificial intelligence, sustainability, and role of small businesses. I think what is important to notice is that looking at the ambitious sustainability goals that even European Commission, but we as Europeans tend to have globally, it seems to me that we will probably not be able to use the traditional ways of using the technology, using the business models. And as Peter has said, SMEs are oftentimes the drivers of these new technological changes, which can achieve something groundbreaking, such as higher degree of the sustainability. So there is a political ambition, and how can we match that with a technology? I would like to share with you 3 observations where we think, and I have been following the topic of artificial intelligence within Google for the last 2 years, where we think the artificial intelligence can be helping us, but all the society and the industries to achieve those sustainable objectives and run new businesses. So the first area is the area of better use of existing resources. If you just continue being in the small enterprise or large enterprise or even government, you just keep doing the same model and same way of dealing with things, it's very difficult to achieve huge savings or energy efficiency, as we heard today. What we are seeing is Google is a company where at the scale Google operates, it wouldn't be possible to use the traditional algorithms as they were coded before. So, if this happens, then do this, and this is the outcome. That's not possible with, billion users of search and Google Maps and videos. That is not possible. And so one of the methods that Google has seen work very well is machine learning. How can you actually use the technology algorithms and train those algorithms and find patterns or have a better prediction to be able to do the same processes much more efficiently? And in the end, for example, save energy. So an example in our case was we have our data centers where we know that data centers consume quite a lot of energy. However, when one of our engineers deployed machine learning to look at the optimization of how the cooling happens in the data center, the machine learning algorithm basically found an optimization where 10% of the energy used for the cooling of the data centers have been saved. Again, to achieve a 10% savings in the energy consumption is almost impossible or unheard of, very difficult to achieve with using the traditional methods, while at the same time, if we deployed this machine learning algorithm, that happened very, very quickly. So better use of existing resources can be also very simple examples. For example, if one of you chose to have a phone which is Android phone, if you go on your battery settings, you will see an item which is called adaptive battery. What does it do is that this is a model which runs in the background of your phone and looks into the history of you. How are you using certain applications? How often do you use them? How many times do you use? Which are the frequent ones and which are less frequent ones? What then the model does is that it deprioritizes the applications that you don't use so often, and it, for example, decreases the resolution of the applications. It deprioritizes them so that the energy needed for draining the battery to keep all the applications ready is decreased, and it's focused on the applications that you are using very frequently and deprioritizing the ones that you are not using so frequently. Now, this is an example where the machine learning model runs in the background of your own device, and you as a user, you don't need to have a technological innovation, or you don't need to be a programmer, and still your battery stays longer, the energy is used much more efficiently. And there are many examples. One example is a company called Pelletarian, which is optimizing we know that, as we heard from Peter, there is one thing is to use renewable sources of energy, as Google, you may have heard, is a zero emission company. But at the same time, the problematics of grids is both regional, national, and international. And so there are companies, very innovative companies, who are looking at the ways, how do you then optimize the uses of energy and put it back in the grid? Again, using the machine learning models. The second area where we see artificial intelligence being very, very helpful for achieving the sustainability, and there's a great opportunity for SMEs innovating in this area, is discovery of new materials and processes. So we know there is the periodic table, and there is almost infinite number of combinations of possible materials. So the Swiss and German scientists, together with Google, but with innovating companies, have come up with new ideas where they run machine learning model simulations, and then they try to look at what materials can be, for example, used for better produce more efficient solar panels. Or another example is what are possible new combinations of materials that allow the batteries to be more efficiently working. So those are examples where the artificial intelligence is simulating, and based on certain conditions that we as humans define, or innovative small companies define, we can find much more efficient way of innovating and finding new materials or processes. And the last area where we have seen artificial intelligence is really working well and is achieving groundbreaking innovation is adaptation to new conditions. What we mean by that? Imagine you are living in a city and you are suffering from floods. When there is too much rain, the water goes, the rivers get big and they go down from the mountains and they kind of flood the cities. Now, there are small companies who are innovating with a lot of historical data and look at the prediction where you can expect the water from these floods to go. And how can you build cities so that the real citizens and houses are not destroyed as a result of these floods. Another one example is one of my colleagues, Karina, she's living in San Francisco, and she mentioned the example of earthquakes and aftershocks, where when we look at the earthquakes, we can't predict the earthquake, but the massive damage to the houses and to populations is coming from the aftershocks, which are happening after earthquake. And so there are small companies, innovative companies, who are looking at historical data where the aftershocks usually happen in a certain region, and they are able to predict, build models where after an earthquake appears, where you can expect some aftershocks. So what I want to show is, and there is much more. There is much more. We have seen these 3 examples of areas where artificial intelligence is really driving, and especially in our case, the machine learning models, training models, is driving innovation, amazing innovation, oftentimes driven by small companies. And similarly to Kipchoge breaking a limit of 2 hours, once there is a certain technological breakthrough, where, for example, we see that artificial intelligence is such a groundbreaking technology, we see that there is amazing and growing number of small enterprises who are actually benefiting from that artificial intelligence breakthrough and who are able to innovate in ways that we have never heard of. My last sentence and comment, because I promised to be respectful to the moderator, but happy to discuss in the Q&A, is that as Mr. Stefanec has said, the drivers, the vehicles of innovation are oftentimes the SMEs. And many times you can ask, so I'm an SME, how do I learn about AI? I don't have capacity to actually develop my own AI. And this is where I think there is the cooperation between the large companies, the governments, which create opportunities. So the moving from digital single market to more a digitized single market is a way to look forward. If we as a Google have released a programming language for programming your own machine learning models or fine-tuning those models without actually need of having the expertise in AI. It's called TensorFlow. We are developing a lot of APIs. So imagine you are driving a car, you know how to brake, steer the wheel, put the gear, but you don't. Not many of us, at least me, know how to build a car. So similarly, how can we together think about these interfaces or APIs, as we call them in the technological world, where I don't know precisely how that is coded, but I know how I can use a certain capability of AI. With the Google Cloud, for example, we use the translation API, text-to-speech recognition, or a visual API of recognizing certain objects. So again, how can the SMEs use a certain capability that has been almost bundled together for them and innovate in new areas where they see it fit? New entrepreneurs like Peter, where they see an opportunity, and how can they plug and play these existing APIs of the AI capability? One last example I will use is a platform called Kaggle. If you haven't heard about them, they are excellent. It's basically, on one hand, there are small entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs coming with the real life problems, defining the problems. And on the other side, there are the engineers who are experts on AI, and they are bridging, working together. So in order to be able to apply the AI is not the solution. AI is the tool where the entrepreneurs oftentimes spot a problem or an opportunity, and then if they are matched with people who understand how AI works, they can come up with very amazing innovative pilots. So long story short, as Eliud Kipchoge has broke the record and has achieved something that is moving our civilization to a new world level, I think the same thing, in order to achieve the sustainability political objectives that Eva has been speaking about and we Europeans are proud of, we need to look at new tools, how the small entrepreneurs can innovate. And I believe artificial intelligence is one of those tools as well.
Thanks, Andre. I'm extremely interested to follow up on this. You mentioned artificial intelligence 11 times. I counted. So I see that the company is really passionate on this. But in Brussels, recently, we had the high-level group from the European Commission on developing an ethical framework for artificial intelligence. The new Commission president has made a personal pledge that Europe needs to be more involved in regulating AI potentially. And I mean, we've all seen that there are growing concerns about user data, about bias, about potential future regulation of AI. Where is the fine line between utilizing artificial intelligence and regulating it for good? What do you think?
So of course, this could be a topic for another panel where I would be eager to discuss, but also hear from entrepreneurs. Maybe in two points, I will offer my perspective in 2 points. The first one is that I think we all, including the policymakers, me, myself, entrepreneurs, we would benefit from learning more and hearing from entrepreneurs, what does AI mean actually? And I think we are working under a lot of assumptions. I was recently at the AmCham conference where a young, brilliant AI engineer was speaking about what AI is. And it was a groundbreaking, eye-opening, because oftentimes when we hear what the AI engineers speak about, it is actually a technology, it's a process. It is far from the kind of the movies that you have seen or we have seen on the airplanes when flying long distance flights and seeing the AI kind of, these disaster scenarios. So I think that the first step would be just, and I think this is really a role for governments and policymakers to educate, train, and demystify what AI is. And oftentimes I think AI is just a machine learning, very simple coding practices in its core, not pretending that, of course, there are not ethical issues, and there will always be a role for philosophers and policymakers to debate, where we as a civilization are heading, and I don't want to undermine those. But before we reach that level of pyramid, I think of the debating, there is so much of application of a basic coding, programming, training the models, and I think we wouldn't want to miss that part, which is very, very practical, especially for small entrepreneurs in Europe, just for the sake of discussing some kind of a hypothetical scenarios. Now, if we speak about AI, I want to say that according to our experience, oftentimes we hear about data and data is the key. We think actually there are 4 components to working with AI models. The first is data. The second is having the knowledge, so knowing how coding works. The third one is having a computational capability, which if you are an SME, more and more you can have a cloud-based solutions. You don't need to have that capability. You can buy a kind of a computational power, which costs fraction of cost. So there is, I would say, there is much more access to those resources. And last and most important, and this is why I'm excited about the role of SMEs, is the creativity of individuals or entrepreneurs and innovation. So it is a much more broader discussion rather than saying it's all about data. It is about knowing how to use the data, coding, spotting the real life problems or opportunities, and innovating. And this all is this is why I'm very optimistic for Europe and for SMEs in Europe, because it is actually the component of defining the problems, spotting the opportunities, as Peter and many others have been speaking about, and this is a critical component. I'm happy to speak about more when it comes to regulation, but I think we should demystify a discussion around artificial intelligence and make sure we are all better educated in the first place.
Thank you. Peter, I want to come back to you on a point you mentioned in your intro about the importance of policymakers and regulation keeping up with technological change and the whole holistic approach. There is a lot of hype, a lot of talk about the sector you're engaged in, electric vehicles, electric charging. Can you please allow a couple of minutes and share a bit more on the actual technology in electrical vehicles, electrical vehicle infrastructure, the future of the sector, and maybe a couple more words on the challenges?
Sure. Interestingly, I would just go back just what was just said, that electromobility itself is a full and the debate about electromobility is a full of myths and untruth and sometimes mystification. And honestly, I see a very important role of the government as a kind of authority to demystify many things like that electric vehicles are worse for the environment than the normal cars, or the batteries will not be able to recycle, or I don't know, you do not have enough range to go to your destination in the winter, or I don't know, the car cannot drive in the rain, even this such a thing. So there are a lot of things which needs to be explained and explained again and again. I'm always surprised when I talk with the people that I'm living in kind of a bubble, because I think everything I understand and everybody who around me understand electric vehicles. But then sometimes I go out of this bubble in a discussion with some different people I don't know, and I'm just still wondering how these things are coming back to me all the time. But a point of I think every new technology is full of myths and they need to be explained. So I fully agree with Andre in this. When it comes to electric vehicles as such, I think, as I said, this is a huge opportunity. I don't know anybody in the world who would say that if we like this would have tomorrow all cars electric, we will not use oil and we'll have clean cities. I don't know anybody who will be against it. Naturally, the question. So if we have a noble goal. We have a goal to go in certain direction, electrify the transportation, make the most people driving electric cars. Naturally, there is a debate about that people should in the cities use a public transportation. I'm not against it. That is not in contradiction. I'm saying that those who are going to use individual transportation, they should use electric car. That's the full step. In the same time, I'm saying that there's as many people driving the bus or train or the bike. Good. Yeah. Myself, I'm using all means of transportation, not only cars. So we have, I think, a good direction. The question is how to get there. And I think if you ask me about the current status of technology, I'm extremely optimist. And actually, if you look on from the technological point of view, we are already there. We have everything which we need. We have all the technology needed for electrification of almost all personal transportation. I'm not talking about long-term transportation, transportation of like trucks and this kind of stuff is a little bit more complicated. But if we talk about the passenger vehicles, we are very easy to go farther, especially taking into account that we are now counting something around 2% of electric vehicles in Europe. So we have a lot of space to go to 20, 30 and more percentage. I think the technology-wise, we are ready. In terms of the battery, the biggest challenge was always the decrease of the cost of the battery, which is happening very significantly. Only recently, the Volkswagen announced that they are below 100 euro per kilowatt hour, which is extremely good news. This is important because this is like half of what was here 2.5 years ago. So the price of the technology is decreasing significantly. Here, maybe what is very important to say is scalability. I think if it is a case of artificial intelligence in Google or production of the batteries or the production of electric vehicles, you need a scale. That's the most important thing. You need a scale. You cannot do things in small things, in small scale. And I think this is something where Europe is still somehow struggling to get to the scale on certain things because we are very often talking about R&D. Which is extremely important. But when I hear a politics saying, what do we want to do with the technology? And they say always, we want to invest into R&D. Wow, that's very good. Everybody wants to invest in R&D, even in Singapore. The problem is how to scale up these things which we will develop in our universities into the scale where we will be effective and be compatible and could compete with the technology delivered from other parts of the world. I will give you an example which is very, I think, interlinked as well to the topics of the electric vehicles, from the solar modules. Solar panels, solar modules are, I've been in this business 10 years ago, and I remember very well how costly it was. And actually, the development, and now it's significantly low. So what it means that cost of the energy which you produce from a solar modules is falling like 8 times or 10 times in the last 10 years. So it's still cheaper and cheaper, and certain location in the world is by far the cheapest source of the commodity, I mean energy as a commodity, as a producer of electrons. How it happens was not only because of R&D. I would even argue that the R&D was less important in this. Actually, the modules which we are using now, which are currently state-of-the-art, are very similar to those which were produced 10 years ago. The development in improvement of efficiency in solar modules was about 1 to 2% a year, while the decrease of the price of the modules was about 20 to 30% a year because of the scale. So it is extremely important to do R&D. I'm not against that. But what we need to understand that R&D is extremely movable asset, or the knowledge are extremely movable assets. If someone is developed in China very easily, we very soon probably will be able to benefit from it in Europe. In many cases, I know there are IP rights, there are some limitations, but actually this could move very quickly. But you cannot move the factory so easy. You cannot move the factory from China to Europe. And that's the point. It is the implication as well for electromobility, because as I said, the batteries are the most critical thing in this respect. And then the second critical thing is naturally the production of vehicles itself. Automotive industry is absolutely great, and European automotive industry is absolutely great in achieving the economy of scale. They are super efficient, and I think in general, if we talk about vehicles as such, as a technology, regardless if electric, it's extremely cheap in this world. You know, if you look on how complicated equipment it is, in terms of the safety, in terms of everything which you have, in terms of how many various suppliers you need to put together in order to produce the vehicle, it's extremely cheap. You know, we are buying it for several multiples of dinner in a good restaurants. And that means that the automotive industry is extremely effective in producing of the goods. So it will be as well very extremely effective in the producing of electric vehicles, but they need to do a big switch. They need to say, okay, we are going to produce electric vehicles in large volumes. And I'm talking about hundreds of thousands, I'm talking about millions of vehicles. So we need to redirect all these big, let's say, dinosaurs into the right direction, which took time. But I'm very optimistic if I look on the largest dinosaur we have in Europe, which is Volkswagen. And they are like, I think I can somehow distinguish between the talks and the real actions. In 11 years being in a business, for many years I heard only talks. There were many talks and no action. But now, in the last 2 years, I can really definitely see that there are actions. There are real actions on the ground, changing of the factories, redesigning the factories, making the big purchase of the batteries, for example, and the new technologies, setup of new contracts with the supply, tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers, introduction of the new models on the market. So I'm really excited about these things. I'm very fine. So in terms of the electric vehicles, charging technologies as well, another topic, but it changes quickly.
Very, very quick question. Electric vehicles and batteries. How worried should Europe be of China's growth in this sector? Because we've seen incredible movement in China in terms of investment, in terms of development of these energies. 20 seconds. Should we be worried about China?
I think that China is at the moment focusing on themselves in terms of this respect. So most of the cars they produce, electric cars, is in China. Stay in China. Most of the batteries they produce stays in China. It doesn't have to be like this forever. I think we have a short period of time when we can adopt, and I think short period of time, I mean maybe 2 or 3 years, when they will have a look around and say, okay, why not to sell it to Europe? At the moment, the only reason why they are not selling their electric cars to Europe is because they have a lot of demand at home. That's the only reason. But one day they will do that, and I think we will see the similar thing as we saw with Koreans. We are from the same city in Slovakia, and there is a big factory of Kia from Korea. When it arrived, I think it was 15 years ago or something, The idea was that let allow Koreans to come to the Eastern Europe to produce the cheap cars for Eastern Europeans. They will not buy BMW anyway. What happens? Kia, Hyundai now are very comparable to all French cars or German cars. They are very aggressive in the south, and they're very good in the end. And I think it could happen with the Chinese cars.
Okay. Eva, I'm really tempted to ask you, because we mentioned China just now, I would like to remind our audience that the European Union is really committed to climate change, but the EU produces less than 10% of the global CO2 emissions. So it's extremely important to manage to get China, Brazil, the US, Mexico, and many, many other countries on board in this important fight. From your perspective, also from the EPP's perspective, what's the best way to engage with third countries on these topics?
Yeah, that's a very crucial topic, and more we see the importance of it. Indeed, EU, as much as driver or leading by example in terms of reducing emissions as it wants to be, still the climate change is a global problem and emissions are global. The best instrument or the best approach would be indeed with climate diplomacy, and this is also what the EU is doing through the international negotiations to get the other largest emitters on board. So that's why the EPP and the EU as well, it's pushing for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. But okay, we don't live in an ideal world. We see, for example, the United States pulling out of the treaty. So we have to be realistic. For EU has a very strong competence or possibility to use its trading policy, and it already does. It is a big kind of economic muscle that it can flex vis-a-vis its partners. We are the largest exporter, actually. So in this sense, there already is in free trade agreements that the EU is signing a chapter on committing the partners to the Paris Agreement and the implementation. And here the EU, in its next terms, I can predict that the trading policy will be more aggressive on this sense. And what is now being discussed, and it has been for many years, it was just never easy to adopt, is to put import tax on imported products which come to the EU, to take into account the CO2 which was produced.
Import tax for goods coming from third countries,
from
correct?
third countries, yeah. Exactly. So this carbon border tax is now being mentioned around Brussels or elsewhere. We hear it also from the industry, from stakeholders who are already having to deal with tariffs, for example, from the US on steel and aluminium. The producers feel disadvantaged vis-a-vis the imports, and it could be an instrument to create a level playing field, at least for the producers in Europe, and then hopefully convince the partners to, well, not convinced, but economically it would then be beneficial for them to implement such measures as well abroad.
Thank you. We have just enough time for a quick Q&A session. We have 20 minutes. So if you have questions, please raise your hands. Please introduce yourselves. If you have a comment, please keep it short. And if you have a question, either address it to the whole panel or specifically to one of our panelists and speakers. So, floor is yours. Yeah. First, and then. Yeah.
Okay. So the question. My name is Michel Marois, and I'm a European Affairs consultant in Brussels. And my question is for Eva. You just mentioned the carbon border tax. I think that Jacques Delors Institute has produced a report by a director. But now, what about the scope of this tax should be limited? Otherwise, you touch the international trade, and the growth is depending on this export capability of Europe. So, all right for a carbon tax, but what should be the scope of this tax on a limited range of products like batteries, etc.?
Second question, we'll take a round of questions.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Günther Martis. I'm an air transport consultant. I have some experience with artificial intelligence, and I have one remark and one question. One remark is in the direction of Google. With all compliment of the developments of Google, but the presetting that Google provides, and you mentioned that briefly, is sometimes simply annoying for a user. I don't want to be limited by Google because they have bright ideas based on artificial intelligence. I want to use my intelligence to be able to select what I want to have in my telephone. But that's another thing. But the main issue for Europe, I think, is we are all dependent with this artificial intelligence and with this modern data processing on servers which are based outside of Europe. Do we really want to continue in this direction? I think there is a major question that Europe has to solve. We want to be the owner of our data, we want to be the manager, and we want to have the devices here in Europe. And I think this is something that even the European legislators should take on board. And as I have heard, they plan to do that. But I think there's still a long way to go. Thank you.
Do we have a third final one for this round? Yeah, please, sir.
Thank you. My name is Mark Boris Andrijanic. I come from Uber. First of all, I would like to thank the panelists for some exceptional remarks. I really think you touched upon all the key issues that we're facing today, not just in our businesses, but also societies. First would be just a remark. So I really believe that ride-sharing can help us achieve the scale that's needed for the EV technology to flourish. And I'm really glad that we're working closely with Greenway in Poland, who's our charging infrastructure provider for our Uber Green product in Krakow. So we're rolling out Uber Greens all across Europe, and it's not always easy because it's the chicken and egg problem. In some places we have loads of electric vehicles, but very poor charging infrastructure. In some others we have very strong infrastructure, but a lack of vehicles because of the lack of ride incentives. So my question here would be, how should we basically target state or municipal or any other incentives on both fronts, both when it comes to cars and when it comes to charging infrastructure? For example, our biggest Uber Green product is right now in Europe, but outside the EU. It's in Kiev, where they have managed with very smart incentives to popularize electric technology to a much greater extent than anywhere else in Europe, apart from Norway. And the second question would be an area that brings together machine learning and AI as well as electric mobility, and that's autonomous mobility. Now, Europe is lagging behind here. We know that US is far ahead. We have Waymo being part of Alphabet at the forefront of innovation there. We also know there's a lot going on in China in this area. So Europe, who's been traditionally the leader in the automotive industry, risks of being left behind. What can we do here as Europe and as private players like us?
Open question to all the panel?
All the panel.
Okay, thank you very much. We have three great questions. First of all, on the carbon border tax, before giving the floor to Eva, the term carbon border tax is typical Brussels talk. Let me just translate it for a wider audience. Maybe not all of you are aware what carbon border tax means. The main premise is the following. Given that the EU is putting a lot of effort into fighting climate change, and we have the emission trading system and so forth, there are many, many third countries which are not investing and they're not taxing their carbon. So the idea is that the EU should impose a carbon border tax to punish and incentivize third countries so they can commit to climate change and the fight against climate change. Eva.
Yes, and the important question on this was raised, and it's not the only questions. There are many questions for the policymakers to figure out before implementing such a measure. Which sectors should it be first? Selection of sectors to include, which emissions to count from the production, or also the transport emissions which are produced while the product is exported. Would it be a tax? Would it be, or on the other hand, including this sector into the European emission trading system, which on some levels seem to be the preferred choice, as taxing in general on EU level is never very supported in the member states. But you raised an important issue, which is how not to become protectionist, that Europe and the whole world flourishes on the global market. We support the global economy and globalization. The idea or the ideal case would be for actually the cleaner, innovative companies producing state-of-the-art technologies to drive this global trade, and actually to then have global trading in such products to incentivize our trading partners, and then we would all be competitive on a global scale in terms of trading these clean technologies and innovative. The innovative companies would then have the advantage on the global market. And just to also highlight how the EU in a certain way has already done this, was with the standards on energy efficiency of products, for example, white goods. We put in place some EU regulation that which labeled the products. So nowadays, third country would not even think about putting on European market a fridge which would not have a AAA standard. People would not buy it, and therefore they started producing these also for their domestic markets, and this then became the standard of what the consumers wanted, and then what the market provided for them. So here, in this sense, I don't think it would impede the global trade. It would actually enable it in many ways.
Thanks. Andre, there was a specific question for Google.
Yeah. So there were two components to the question. The first, I'm always, sorry to hear if you, as a user, are not happy, and I think that the way how we see services, but also AI, is we have a human-centric view, which means the AI should be running in the learning model should be running behind, not bother, and you choose whether you want to use it or not. Do you want a longer battery life or not? You can choose that. You can turn off. So I think that I would agree with you in sense of the only way to go forward is empowering users, and we believe that also in communication with regulators, to give user a choice. And then, I have 4 kids. I'm much more conservative in my choices of using technology. But then there are, millennials who are much more appreciating any kind of innovative tool and service. And so let us have that choice. The second question was about the data and technology and where the data is stored. I think this question is one of those where we all would benefit from learning a little bit more, including me, about the global nature of data, technology, and artificial intelligence. So in some way, I think that it is almost as if I would be saying, I want the electricity that I have in my house to be produced from France. We all sense that it's probably not the right, proper question. And what I want to suggest is, first we should be looking at, so of course there are certain limitations, but are the basic fundamental regulatory requirements respected? Is my data protected, privacy, personal data? Is my data kept safe? I can tell you the data on my computer at home with my kids running around is much less safer than my data being somewhere in a cloud. So this would be the question. Is the data kept while respecting the existing regulatory frameworks for us Europeans? That could be an interesting question. The second interesting question is, I think we oftentimes get so much excited about discussing a very broad macroeconomic questions that we forget to put an honest, evidence-based impact assessment on SMEs. And here I would be very cautious. So does what I am proposing as a European regulator or as a European citizen, did I capture in properly the impact on SMEs? And here I think we oftentimes are on one hand speaking about ability of European SMEs to innovate and be global and scale, and at the same time we translate the regulatory actions into tools which, again, I don't want to, I would caution just to use the evidence-based approach, and I think oftentimes the voice of SMEs is heard in the political debates, but is not heard in the process of regulation. So regulatory debates. So that would be my two questions. I think the technology today in itself, it has a global nature. I don't agree with some kind of a libertarian perspective that everything should be free and market will solve everything. But at the same time, we should be careful about the implications of believing that we can somehow create walls around Europe and everything will be European, including the data, regulation, etc. I think this is fundamentally, we all would benefit from talking to people who understand the technology and how technology works.
Thank you. Peter, there was a reference, perhaps, to autonomous mobility.
Yeah, so first, just to address your question, and then about topic the cars and chicken and egg problem. Interestingly, in Central and Eastern Europe, the situation is that, I have to humbly say that as well, because of us and what we do is that the infrastructure is in better ratio of infrastructure to the number of electric cars is better than, for example, in Netherlands. So the problem, in fact, in Central and Eastern Europe, and at least in the countries we are operating, is that there are not so many electric vehicles as it should be, and the developer of the charging infrastructure is doing their work. So that's the things. Why it is happening, I think we should look on various things. One is definitely the activity of the car manufacturers, which time to time used to overlook this market and, for example, force the marketing campaigns to the different countries or make available the cars in different countries and not in Central and Eastern Europe. So, but things are hopefully changing now, and hopefully there will be more cars available. At the moment, it's, for example, a very big problem to buy electric vehicle in my country. A waiting list is sometimes half a year and even more, and which definitely discourages many people. So these things hopefully will change as soon as the car manufacturers take this development seriously. And another thing is very special situation is regarding the support of the buying of electric vehicle. In general, in the Central and Eastern European countries, there are very often the ownership of the car is not. There are no many taxes or not many fees which you need to pay for that. So all the fees or taxes are very low comparing to Western Europe. Therefore, when you want to support, for example, the special technology like electric vehicles, what is enough to do in Norway is just not to tax the electric vehicles, and it's more than enough support. Since we do not have so many taxes on ownership of the cars itself, that's not so easy, and you need to give a direct support if you want to support something which is maybe politically problematic. When you ask me what should be done in going forward, and sorry, I want to just make one more reference. The problem with overlooking this region is especially very interesting when you mention the Ukraine, because the adoption of new technologies in new emerging markets could be sometimes even faster than in established market. And Ukraine is, I think, a very good example. Nobody would expect that Ukraine is the leader in electromobility in Central and Eastern Europe, for example. But this is true. It is happening. When it comes to the policies, I think we need to understand the development of electromobility and charging infrastructure at the end is very capital-intensive business. It is really down-to-earth business where you need to go dig the cable into the ground, put the very expensive technology on, and this is very complicated in certain sense, and you need availability of special financing mechanism which reflect the fact that this technology, these networks which we are building is a long term, is going to depreciate within 10 years, and even if you talk about the connection and cables, it's maybe 40 years. So it requires special mechanism which would be able to deploy in the situation when the market is still on the beginning of S-curve. Everybody is familiar with the S-curve when the technology develops slowly at the beginning, then it's growing very fast and then becoming established technology. We are still in the early stage of the S-curve, therefore the investment into the charging infrastructure, for example, are still relatively risky. And we still not have a clear visibility when the electromobility will really grow significantly and fast. We have a lot of, let's say, expectation, and we are very optimistic, as I said, but we we are not clear when it really happen. So we need to have a mechanism available. I think there's a matter of policy where even the small players are able to tap this and execute, because as was said, in this early stage of the S-curve, the SMEs and smaller players are more important probably than the established large players. And what we see in case of a charging infrastructure, we see a huge shift of the revenue generation from downstream oil and gas, so gas stations, to the world of distributed ownership of many players. Shall it be shopping malls, hotels, restaurants, or even the big players like us who own the infrastructure. The ownership of the infrastructure will be very distributed. And so they are not the big hegemons like, I don't know, Shell or this kind of companies who can make very easily huge of investments. So you should need to find the mechanism how these small companies and how these players can get to the proper financial instrument. And last but not least thing is the change of the regulation in the energy business. At the moment, we pay more for connection to the grid than for the technology itself, because we do not have a proper tariffs which would fit to the needs of the charging infrastructure development in Europe. It's not only a problem of Slovakia, but it's a problem of the whole Europe. That these things needs to change and take into account the long-term benefits which electric vehicles brings to our society.
Two other follow-ups from Eva and from Andre. Please keep it brief.
Yes, just a brief reaction also on what you were saying before, but on the topic of electric cars and charging in general. You were talking about batteries, and this is also something we discussed in the EPP, where we think there's a great opportunity for the EU in terms of also energy security. Now we rely on the batteries produced outside of the EU. They are sourced outside of the EU. So in this sense, we really hope there can be innovation in terms of creating European sourced, produced, and put on the market battery. And on markets or countries like Slovakia, which is the world's biggest car producer in terms of per capita, there's a potential that actually this could then shift for either electric vehicles or the battery production, that this can then enable such innovations. And in terms of financing, indeed, this is market with a lot of risks. Also, SMEs in general operate with a lot of risks and need such capital, where the EU indeed can be the right partner in this. It's good to see that from 2021, the new instrument, the EU Invest, will provide 11.25 billion euros of budget guarantees, so either loan guarantees or risk capital for equity funds for such firms, SMEs. And further 11.25 billion will be available for innovation and research and development. So both of these combined, there's a big potential for such innovative companies like yours can really access such finance, which is unavailable for them on the domestic market. So on the EU sphere, especially from the European Investment Bank and its partners, such capital can then spur such innovation.
Andre, quick word.
I promised three kind of perspectives on the question that was asked, and I wanted to come back with the third one, which was we speak in Brussels bubble around data. But what I hear from our colleagues around who are experts on the artificial intelligence, that oftentimes it is not the data or the big data as was the buzzword many years ago. Having big data means you can't innovate efficiently, but the shift is now happening towards having data sets. So having sets of data which are well curated, which are in a proper structure, good label, and available for small companies to innovate. And I think that is an interesting perspective of AI experts, which basically say, for me to have immense number of data is actually a burden, because I have to curate it, I have to waste my time cleaning the data. For SMEs instead, what we need is data sets in a proper structure, kind of cleaned properly and ready to be used for business models. And so that, to conclude, we provide such data sets in the image search, in the video search. We provide the tools which are free for anybody to use, tools such as facets, which allow you to look into data and see whether there might be some kind of a skewing towards certain bias, towards certain components of the data, etc., etc. These data sets, making these data sets available and allowing SMEs to find an opportunity and define how that opportunity or that problem can be used by AI or machine learning in our case, and repeating and using the data set, I think that is the key for the SMEs to innovate.
We have 5 minutes for final 1 or 2 quick questions. Sir, please. And second one there. Thank you. The mic, please. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ludo van Ooyen. I'm retired from an international business career. Can I ask a question to Mr. Ivan Stefanek also? You mentioned 2 things, and I have not heard enough about those 2 things. First, you mentioned the financing. Well, we heard a little bit. The European Investment Bank wanted to stop all loans to fossil fuels. But because of pressure from this commission, they postponed the decision to do this, because the lobby from the fossil fuel industry was so strong that they couldn't do it. What's your opinion about that? Because then we talk about a lot more money than the 11 billion that you just mentioned. The second question to you is, you said the smaller companies need the skills. Have you heard enough this morning about how to improve the skills of the new entrepreneurs?
Okay, and the second question.
Yes, thanks a lot. First of all, thanks for the interesting interventions this morning. My name is Linda Kaltje. I work for the European Climate Foundation, and I was quite interested from the panel, but also from MEP Stefanek, to hear what would you think really drives the change to kind of bridge the clean investment gap. We heard a lot, and kind of really, if you look at the projections, not only on electric vehicles, but also on renewables being built in some of the Central and Eastern European countries, it's relatively worrying. So I would really be interested to see, like, to go a bit deeper on what it is that can ensure that the investments and innovation is really driven on the ground there. Thank you.
The question is for the MEP or for the panel?
Both.
Okay. Mr. Stefanek, please.
Thank you for those questions. Regarding financing, you asked whether I agree with this decision to, let's say, to step back and to allow fossil fuel lobby to be financed. I don't agree with this decision. I think our priorities should be in line with our financing. I think it's very crucial that even FC and now, as we have heard, InvestEU instrument, where will be a lot of money, will be just used for priorities in terms of green technologies, in terms of digitization, in terms of reinforcement of the European economy. So I think we cannot talk about priorities and about industry policy and then about environmental policy. We have to have only one clear policy, which should be industrial and environmental at the same time, and it must be supported by financial instruments. I think it's very, very crucial. Otherwise, we cannot achieve the objectives which are set up. Second point was regarding skills, and you asked whether I've heard enough. Yes, I'm encouraged. The answer is yes. I am encouraged by those people who have enough skills. I think it's a challenge for regulators and legislators to enable and to share those skills. So therefore, I push all the time to have more funds for programs, as I mentioned before, Erasmus for young entrepreneurs, and also e-skills programs. So there is a lot of initiatives, good initiatives for European perspective, but they very often they don't have enough funding. So I'm pushing all the time to allocate much more from European funds in order to support programs for sharing skills, because in my view there is enough skills, but still not enough information and enough knowledge among all young entrepreneurs. So I think it's the challenge also to create programs for sharing experience in order to improve those skills.
Thank you. Very brief closing remarks from the panel if you want to refer to the question. Eva?
On the EIB, I did not follow the process of postponement of any such financing. As when I was in an event recently, I know that their EIB was announcing actually such shift, that the financing and the loaning would be sustainable. And in terms of lending to fossil fuel companies, they also, I think, vary in terms of products and in terms of their innovation. There are companies which now redirect their shift to, for example, hydrogen production and how to then diversify the portfolio, for example, to production of blue hydrogen. So as long as I think innovation into cleaner technologies can be incentivized by such financing, I wouldn't dismiss it completely.
Closing thoughts?
Maybe I have a remark. We as a company was one who benefited from the loan from EIB, so I have very fresh and in-hand experience from that. It was 1 year ago where we negotiated, and I think we are in a very good example in this, because EIB and all these instruments in Europe, and if we talk about the loan instruments, they are available on small volumes to small enterprises, SMEs, 200,000 euro. That's easy. And then you have big loans going 100 million over, and usually to the utilities or road constructions, all these things, very low risk. But there is missing in between. So we got a loan of 17 million euro, and to be honest, it was a painful process to get that. And actually, probably only coincidentally that my previous career started in banking gives me a capability to negotiate with EIB the loan itself, because I do not have an army of the lawyers and financial advisors and so on and so forth. I do have lawyers who help me, and so on, but it's definitely not the same debate as you are negotiating a $500 million loan with EDF. Yeah? So I think there needs to be a structural change as well on the side of this institution, who, if they want to provide the financing to SMEs somewhere in a scale between 10 million and 100 million, they have to have a different approach to how they do the business. It may seem that 10 million or 50 million looks too much for the SMEs, but given the sector we are working in, as I said, this is investment heavy. We need to do investment on the ground. They really 17 million is really only a starting point in our business. So I think what is a gap here is the real execution and transfer of this huge amount of money which Europe has available through FC instrument and all this into the companies who are in a scalable phase. So we have a lot of money in small investments. We have a lot of money in putting into the large investment, roads and everything, but in the middle we are somehow we may have a lot of money available, but we are not able to execute, and I think it's a way to improve that.
Okay, Andre.
Just to perspectives, on the skills, I fully agree with you that more needs to be done. With rightly MEP Stefanec, and there is a role of companies as well as public sector. So that's why, for example, Google is running a huge program called Grow with Google, where you can choose a track of skills, online training, be it you are a student, you are unemployed, you are employed, you are an SME. If you want to learn a little bit basics of artificial intelligence and machine learning, you can look into a machine learning crash course, or you can look at Finnish government elements of AI. But the machine learning crash course, I would really recommend you. We are looking into ways of even educating or providing some perspective to policymakers on the machine learning. And on the question of, and by the way, we have been awarded by European Commission several years for the millions of users that have taken this course. And on the sustainability, I would point you to a Google Sustainability Report 2019 that puts together recommended practices and technological approaches that we have seen work in deploying the technology to achieve higher efficiency and sustainability. And because we are speaking about SMEs, my conclusion is, my call for all of us and for policymakers is, SMEs are part of finding new, efficient, innovative ways of achieving sustainability goals, and we should be keeping in mind and careful about the unintended consequences of the regulatory discussions here in Brussels and in general, how those will enable SMEs to succeed and innovate.
On this note, I don't want to keep you away from the coffee break outside. Thank you so much for our panelists. Thanks for joining us. We have a long program ahead, so stay with us for Netted Work today. Thank you.
Thank you.